Okay, so Westworld gave us a Wild West full of hyper-intelligent androids, existential crises, and Anthony Hopkins being terrifyingly calm. And yeah, that's all pretty wild. But here's the thing. The actual American frontier was, in many ways, even weirder. I'm talking about a West where the US Army thought camels were the future of warfare, where some of the most feared outlaws were women dressed as men robbing stagecoaches, and where entire towns were essentially governed by free-roaming pigs. Not figuratively, literally pigs. So today we're putting Westworld's stylish, dystopian frontier up against the real one. And I promise you, reality is going to win the weird contest almost every single time. Buckle up, partners. Let's start with what Westworld gets right, because credit where credit is due. The show leans into the mythology of the American West. You've got your gunfighters, your saloons, your dusty desert towns with wooden storefronts and whiskey-soaked piano music. It pulls from the same visual language that John Ford and Sergio Leone built across decades of cinema. The Man in Black is basically a remix of every brooding anti-hero who ever squinted into a sunset. And Sweetwater, the show's central frontier town, is this perfectly curated version of what we imagine when someone says, the Old West. It's gorgeous, it's cinematic, and it is, by design, a fantasy. That's actually the whole point of the show. Westworld, the theme park, exists because rich people want to live out a romanticized cowboy fantasy. The hosts, the android characters, are programmed in to fulfill narratives that feel authentic, but are really just polished versions of myths we've been telling ourselves for over a century. The show is literally about how we construct false versions of the past, which makes it the perfect jumping-off point to ask, what was the real West actually like? Because, spoiler alert, it was not a clean narrative. It was messy, bizarre, and often completely absurd. One of the most fascinating things about the real frontier that almost never shows up in Westerns is how fluid gender presentation actually was. And no, I'm not projecting modern ideas backward. This is well documented. The West was full of people who, for a wide variety of reasons, lived as a gender different from the one they were assigned at birth, and in many cases, nobody around them cared all that much. Take Charlie Parkhurst, one of the most famous stagecoach drivers in California. Charlie was born Charlotte Parkhurst, but lived as a man for decades, drove stagecoaches through some of the most dangerous terrain in the state, lost an eye from a horse kick, and reportedly even voted in the 1868 presidential election, making Charlie possibly the first woman, or at least the first person assigned female at birth, to vote in a US national election. Nobody knew Charlie's biological sex until after death. Then there's Pearl Hart, who in 1899 pulled off one of the last known stagecoach robberies in the United States. She dressed in men's clothing, wielded a revolver, and became a media sensation. When she was captured, newspapers couldn't decide if she was a dangerous criminal or a folk hero. Some reporters were weirdly obsessed with whether she was attractive. Because apparently, even in 1899, that was the priority when covering a woman who literally committed armed robbery. And these weren't isolated cases. Historians have found dozens of examples of people on the frontier living outside of traditional gender norms. Sometimes as outlaws, sometimes as soldiers, sometimes just as regular townsfolk. The West was so sparsely populated and so chaotic that there was, in a strange way, more room to be whoever you wanted. Westworld imagines a place where you can be anyone. Turns out the real West kind of already offered that, at least for some people, in some very specific and complicated ways. Alright, now let's talk about the camels, because this is my favorite piece of Wild West history, and I will never stop bringing it up. In 1856, the United States Army, under the direction of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, imported about 75 camels from the Middle East and North Africa to use as pack animals in the American Southwest. The logic was actually kind of sound. The desert terrain of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona was brutal on horses and mules. Camels, on the other hand, were literally built for that environment. They could carry more weight, travel farther without water, and handle extreme heat. So they shipped the camels over, stationed them in Camp Verde, Texas, and started running experiments. And honestly, the camels performed beautifully. They outpaced mules. They handled the terrain like champions, and they barely needed water. On paper, the US Camel Corps was a smashing success. There was just one problem. Everyone hated the camels. The soldiers thought they were disgusting. They spit, they smelled, they bit. They terrified horses so badly that entire cavalry units would scatter when a camel showed up. One officer reportedly described them as the most unpleasant creatures God ever made. And when the Civil War broke out in 1861, the whole program was abandoned. The camels were auctioned off, released into the wild, or just kind of forgotten about. For decades afterward, people across the Southwest reported seeing feral camels wandering the desert. There are accounts from the 1880s and 1890s of cowboys encountering camels and having absolutely no idea what they were looking at. Imagine being a rancher in Arizona and just seeing a camel crest a hill at sunset. That is wilder than anything in Westworld, and I will die on that hill. Now let's talk about daily life, because this is where the gap between Westworld and reality gets really wide. In the show, Sweetwater is this quaint, orderly little town. There's a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office. It's tidy. It makes sense. Real frontier towns were not like that. Many early Western towns were essentially thrown together overnight when a gold strike or a railroad route was announced. They had no sanitation, no planning, and in many cases, no real law enforcement. And the animals? Oh, the animals. Pigs in particular were everywhere. In towns like early San Francisco, Cincinnati, and dozens of smaller settlements, pigs roamed the streets freely. They were the unofficial garbage disposal system. People would throw their waste into the streets, and the pigs would eat it. In some towns, pigs outnumbered human residents by significant margins. Cincinnati was literally nicknamed Porkopolis because of the sheer volume of swine, and this wasn't just a Midwest thing. Frontier towns across the West had similar situations. Pigs would wander into saloons, root around under buildings, and occasionally cause genuine chaos. There are newspaper accounts of pigs disrupting court proceedings, knocking over market stalls, and, in at least one case, biting a sitting judge. And it wasn't just pigs. Cows, goats, chickens, and dogs all roamed freely. The idea of a clean, organized Western town is almost entirely a Hollywood invention. The real West smelled terrible, was crawling with animals, and was held together by a combination of stubbornness and luck. If Westworld's designers had made their park historically accurate, the guests would have demanded a refund within the first hour. So why do we prefer the Westworld version? Why do we keep telling stories about noble gunslingers and dramatic showdowns when the reality was camels and pig-infested streets? Well, part of it is just good storytelling. A clean narrative with clear heroes and villains is more satisfying than the messy, weird truth. But there's something deeper going on too. The myth of the American West has always been about identity. It's a story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. Rugged, independent, brave, morally clear. Westworld is actually brilliant at interrogating this. The whole show asks what happens when you peel back the fantasy and look at what's underneath. And what's underneath, both in the show and in real history, is complicated, messy, and often deeply uncomfortable. The real West was a place of tremendous violence, displacement, and exploitation. It was also a place of genuine freedom, reinvention, and absurdity. Cross-dressing outlaws, camel cavalry, pig-run towns, these aren't just funny footnotes. They're evidence that the frontier was a place where the normal rules didn't apply, for better and for worse. And that, honestly, is way more interesting than any scripted narrative a theme park could offer. So the next time you watch Westworld and think, wow, that's wild, just remember that the real West had feral camels, stagecoach robbing women in disguise, and towns where a pig could interrupt a legal proceeding. Reality didn't need android hosts or narrative loops to be absolutely unhinged. It did that all on its own. If you enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really does help the channel more than you might think. If you're new here and you like history that's weird, surprising, and just a little bit unhinged, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And I want to hear from you. What's the strangest real history fact you know about the American West? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and the best ones might end up in a future video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.